lunch dip will hopefully stay away for this interesting round of 4 presentations on the means of proof. And I think we will continue lots of the discussions we've already heard this morning. We have 4 speakers, and I will introduce them right now so they can follow up easily. Each of them has 15 minutes to present, and then after all 4 presentations, please ask lots of questions and let's have a fruitful discussion. First of all, Jess Walmsley from Manchester will present her paper on the cycle of rejection and how the digitization of the UK asylum system impacted LGBTQ plus asylum seekers. And after that, Hadayat Selim from Finland, doctoral researcher at Abo Academy, will give her insights on findings from Finland into asylum claims based on sexual orientation. Then Ine Mavot, a legal officer at the Belgian Refugee Council or something comparable in Brussels, will present her research on Afghan gay men and the assessment of the need for international protection. And then we will end with Pip McKnight coming from the University of Birmingham, maybe a little bit away from the means of proof, but at least with a good title, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Expectations of Performance and Participations in SOGI Asylum Claims. Please, Jess, start off.
Hi everybody, I'm Jess. I'm a master's student at the University of Manchester, and this paper has been kind of influenced from my undergraduate research, which was titled Queried About Being Queer, and looking at how the digitisation of the asylum system has impacted queer asylum seekers, especially looking at how it has aided the burden of proof and how digital evidence has come into a lot more asylum cases in the UK. So these are my initial research questions going into the research, and it was really looking at the emergence of digital media in the UK asylum system and the implications of relying on digital evidence, so moving away from traditional forms of telling a narrative, which would have been in witness statements or testimony, and now looking at how smartphones are used or images, photos are used to corroborate or compete against that testimony. And then looking at are there any guidelines in place? So how is digital evidence stored? How is it monitored? Are there any privacy protections for people who submit maybe intimate or explicit forms of evidence? And what are the Home Office doing to kind of moderate these forms of evidence? So I think we can all agree that digitisation has happened in a lot of different areas of the world, and within the Home Office, you could argue that it's kind of been motivated by a desire to get rid of the backlog, which is spoken about a lot in UK politics. A lot of right-wing media and the Conservative Party spoke about this a lot, and I think this has really fueled this age of immediacy where efficient and speedy processing is more preferable than listening to testimonies or hearing from witnesses. And I think this quote really sums it up, where decision makers are deciding the fate of asylum seekers in the time it takes to consume a fast food lunch. And this really kind of pinpointed how digital evidence can be used to speed up the process rather than relying on these traditional methods. Again, defining digital evidence, I really just mean anything that can be stored electronically on a smartphone, in the cloud, on a laptop, and it ranges from these different various forms of evidence. And then with access to smartphones, again, more research into how digital technology has become more accessible. I don't want to neglect the positives of people having access to smartphones. I think that smartphones have really encouraged connections, networks, friendships, access to shelter, access to maps. But it's these things that I kind of argue that have been exploited by the Home Office. I think they can be used to compete, as I said, because, say, GPS data and location history can be used to kind of question and interrogate and scrutinise a person's claim. This actually came to me looking at a phrase from Macklin, which was the pattern of rejection. And she spoke about how rejection, evidence can be rejected if it's deemed insufficient. But if one person puts forward a new piece of evidence, be it a different style of witness statement or a different style of evidence, there's an expectation that everybody should be able to be at this new level of what is expected, this new standard of evidence. And I've kind of expanded on that theory by calling it a cycle, because I think this has also allowed for an escalation in the types of evidence that can be admitted into the Home Office. So now, not witness statements, could you move to photographs? Can you move to messaging history? If that's rejected, where does that go? Where does that lead the person to go to find new forms of evidence to prove their sexual orientation to the Home Office? And I think this is a really interesting way to look at it, where if you keep rejecting people's appeals, how far are they going to have to go to prove to you? And if there keeps being new forms of evidence allowed, again, it just keeps escalating. So as I said before, I was looking at the verification procedures within the Home Office and whether there were any. And there's a lot of examples in literature on inconsistencies between evidence and how it is scrutinized, and especially in assessing the authenticity of digital documents, with many people saying that they are very easily to fabricate or fraud or create just for the purposes of an asylum hearing. And I think one example, which was from Bern in 2015, really stood out to me, where someone was asked to present email evidence to show who they'd been in contact with, where they'd been, what they'd been, who they'd been talking to, whatever. And they came to their appeal hearing with 26 emails all ready to go, and they were instantly rejected on the basis that, well, they could have just been fabricated and written for the purpose of this hearing. She then refers to another case where someone is penalised for not having any email evidence to corroborate their story. And I think this shows a real vast inconsistency between how evidence is understood in the Home Office. So again, we've had a lot of talk today about the nature of the process for LGBTQ asylum seekers, but I kind of leaned into the kind of perverse nature of the system, especially looking at leaks from The Observer, which showed the list of kind of sexual questions asked by the Home Office based on Western stereotypes. Was it what music do you like, what your sexual preferences are? So people in the queer community are already starting in this base of kind of this interrogation, this proving themselves, having to adhere to heteronormative standards. And again, adding on the load of digital evidence and that extra burden, it kind of all falls into that category of being quite perverse and a bit unnecessary. Let's go ahead to that one. So my research was then I did some case study research into the publicly available Home Office tribunal court documents, and was looking at these especially for the specific types of evidence being asked for by the Home Office and the specific types of evidence being put forward. So I would say here, so all asylum seekers need to prove that they're at risk, but how? And that was the question that led me to look deeply into the types of evidence being asked for. So I was going to go back 2 slides. So I put on here the types of evidence that came up in the transcripts. So you can see dating apps, the Sweatbox is a queer gym in Soho, there's pictures at Gay Village, there's pictures at Pride, there's voice notes, I'll talk about the emojis again in a bit, messages, location, and this kind of gives you a flavour of the sort of evidence that people are putting in their evidence bundles to adhere to the credibility assessment and prove their identity. So I'm going to move on to photographs at Pride events. A lot of literature states that it's really encouraged for asylum seekers who are queer to take lots of pictures at Pride events, at queer spaces, because that can be really useful to prove your identity. And the transcripts reveal a lot of inconsistencies to how these photographs are dealt with. Again, linking to the example of the emails I said, in the transcripts, there were 4 applicants who submitted images at Pride, and their evidence was deemed insufficient, saying anyone can stand under a neon sign at a venue saying GAY. It doesn't mean anything. But for another applicant, the judge was criticised as the applicant for showing no evidence of having attended Pride events or queer spaces. And I think, as Claire was saying, if they're on £9 a week, how are people expected to go to these spaces? Are they accessible? And I think being based in Manchester, we have quite a notorious gay village, and there's a lot of research to suggest that these are quite racist spaces where they're not very tolerable to people who are not white or cis male. And again, it's putting pressure on people to attend these quite risky places, and they're very heteronormative, very westernized, so not very safe. This is another example. These messages are all taken from one person's application. This is in their 5th appeal process that they offered these messages. And they were from Cameroon. As you know, probably in Cameroon, it is legal to be gay. And these messages were scrutinized between themselves and their same-sex partner. So these messages came after they submitted evidence of attending a queer gym at Pride, all of this deemed insufficient kind of immediately. And it shows the escalation, this cycle of rejection that I'm trying to convey, where this sort of evidence was deemed insufficient, so what's next? If this isn't insufficient, what's next? And this applicant actually had to hand over their phone to the judge, and the judge read out these messages and ended up scrutinizing the emojis used to prove their sexual orientation. So it's quoted the kissy heart face emoji, the pink heart, and I think what really shocked me is how these were believed over their testimony and how these were kind of really valued as, you know, evidence of their sexual orientation rather than anything else that was submitted. And think then, again, if these forms of evidence aren't being deemed sufficient, this could take you to intimate and explicit content. So I included a quote here from Shevlin saying that no court would ask a claimant to provide a pornographic film, but people do go to these lengths. And an example in the transcripts that I analysed looked at a lesbian couple where she presented intimate photos of herself and same-sex partner. Again, I think this was their 4th appeal hearing, and these were deemed to be, I think it's on this one, not persuasive of a lesbian relationship between the two women. And the judge deemed them as staged, and they kind of came back to that with, well, would you say that a wedding photo of a heterosexual couple is not genuine of their relationship? No, because pictures are staged. And so again, it's these inconsistencies where there's no standard or nothing in place to say how to authenticate these forms of evidence. And I think we've touched on today the lack of sensitivity and the need for more training and for knowledge of how people from different cultures and different countries express their sexuality. Shows that with the rejection of non-digital evidence, it could mean that if one person is submitting explicit evidence, does that mean, again, that everyone needs to submit explicit evidence? Where does it end and where does the cycle stop? So the impacts of digital evidence, I said there's no standards of verification, meaning, again, different standards of proof for each application, and there's no way of understanding like what evidence is sufficient to prove sexual orientation. And again, smartphones, the data on our smartphones changes every day. Technology is updating all the time. It's interesting to ask, how would AI come into this? Future research questions on how AI can question truth and truth claims. But the applicant that simply handed over their smartphone, that immigration officer, that judge had access to such a wide range of information that is so sensitive and personal. And it's questionable, what is that for? Why is that being used and how is that being treated? So I put forward some potential solutions to prevent this cycle. And again, it's standardized guidelines for digital evidence, adequate training, and then looking into privacy protections. You know, a lot of us are privileged enough to have GDPR that protects our data. Why is that different for people who are submitting such personal information? Where is this going? And I think digital evidence not being the primary determiner of a sexual orientation, especially in the cases of seeing with the emojis being used over someone's personal story, if they've not got standards in place to authenticate, understand the evidence, then they shouldn't be processing it in the first place. And actually, I think Sweden, maybe they've said that they wouldn't accept digital evidence because they can't authenticate it, whereas I think the UK have kind of decided they're experts in the topic and can accept it. So again, considering more appropriate forms of evidence to engaging with LGBT support groups. There's a lot of different ways to authenticate someone, and also, again, as we've said here, focusing on the persecution, not the identity. So the concluding thoughts, there's a lot of text, sorry. My conclusion was that the tribunal documents really reveal the cycle of rejection and how one piece of evidence being rejected leads to going further and further and further, and it's just you're stuck in a never-ending loop. And it's perpetuated by the lack of standard of protocols, lack of verification standards, leading to these inconsistencies, which really put asylum seekers in an impossible situation where how could you know what is going to be acceptable and what lengths do you need to go to prove your identity to be true. So that's that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be presenting some of my research as part of my doctoral thesis, which I'm doing in Finland as within the Department of Psychology. So you might think how psychology is relevant. Of course, the human factor is impossible to isolate from asylum interviewing and decision making. So what we're concerned with as a research group is how to apply the knowledge on appropriate investigative interviewing techniques. So what kind of interview questions elicit the most detailed and accurate questions from both asylum seekers and other types of vulnerable witnesses, and how we can eliminate bias in asylum decision making. I should also mention that I came to this topic through practical experience as a refugee status determination eligibility officer in Egypt, where UNHCR has a mandate to conduct asylum adjudications. And I've also represented a number of queer asylum seekers in being granted asylum in Egypt with a civil society organization. So without further ado, I'm going in the wrong direction, I think. Yeah, okay. So Finland has a reputation for being quite progressive in terms of advancing the rights and providing equal treatment for sexual minorities. And ILGA Europe ranks it as sixth at the European scale in terms of its compliance with standards and human rights principles for queer people. However, one of the areas where it does fall short is when it comes to its asylum evaluations, and this has to do with the prevalence of stereotypical understandings and narratives, which we've talked about at length already, especially in the last panel. But we do echo many of these findings in Finland. And a recent report that was published by the Finnish Health and Welfare Agency really casts doubt over the myth of the safe haven for queer people in Finland, especially when they identify with multiple minority labels. So foreign-born sexual and gender minorities definitely have a different experience than Finns. And this is seen in various spheres of life, so in terms of discrimination in employment, in terms of the lack of queer-friendly reception centers for asylum seekers. And many of the respondents of this report highlight that they continue to experience homophobia at the hands of their diaspora communities in Finland, as well as very prevalent xenophobia by the local population. However, despite these shortcomings, one very noteworthy feature of the Finnish asylum landscape is that the Finnish Immigration Service has been exceptionally open to collaborating with both researchers and subject matter experts, to the extent that many research groups, including our own, has had the opportunity to be granted, not without difficulty, but ultimately being granted asylum case files, which include the detailed interview transcripts and the corresponding decisions. And this formed the basis of my PhD research over the past few years. So in 2021, we were granted access to 218 asylum case files based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And we analyzed 129 of these for the purpose of the studies I'm about to present. So for the 129 cases that we analyzed, here you can see the socio-demographic profile of the applicants. As you might expect, the large majority of them are cisgender men of a young mean age of around 26 years. The most heavily represented countries in Finland, or in our sample, were Iraq, Russia, and Cameroon. And most of the applicants identified as gay. And we tried to identify certain differences in asylum outcomes depending on the, the applicant's gender or their stated sexual orientation or their country. And the only difference that we could find is that, well, actually, asylum applicants who identified as atheists were much more likely to be granted asylum as those who identified as Christian or Muslim. And this echoes some of the findings that we've discussed earlier, that there seems to be, in the mind of asylum officials, an incompatibility between being religious or even not rejecting organized religion and being queer. So just to present what our main research questions were, first of all, we were interested in how asylum officials motivate the rejections of asylum claims based on sexual orientation. I should add that, unfortunately, we had too few cases that were based on gender identity to be able to make meaningful findings, and it's an unfortunate, finding, but there was no way around it. And the second question that we had were, what questions do they ask to elicit a narrative based on sexual orientation, and to what extent are the formulations of officials' questions appropriate in gathering detailed and accurate statements from asylum seekers? And the third question was, when confronted with a late disclosure, so when asked why they delayed the disclosure of their sexual orientation, what reasons did the applicants give? I'll start first with our findings regarding the decisions. So first of all, quite unsurprisingly, most of the decisions, 70%, were motivated based on the finding that the sexual orientation of the applicant was not deemed credible. And we found that quantity of detail was the most heavily cited credibility indicator in rejecting the claims. And here I want to put forward that, aside from the reservations that one might have about sufficiency of detail as an indicator, from a psychological perspective, it's very important to highlight that the cross-cultural dimension is very relevant here, because studies in legal psychology have repeatedly found that individuals who belong to collectivistic societies tend to provide fewer legally relevant details than individuals from individualistic societies in response to an open-ended question prompt. So this is something that officials should be mindful of, and that we've tried to, in our trainings with them, to highlight that regardless of the nature of the claim, an applicant may not be able to meet an arbitrary level of detail that's expected by the official simply because of their cultural background. Another important credibility indicator I wish to highlight is implausibility, which was found to have motivated 50% of the rejections in our cases. And we know that implausibility is a slippery slope in the sense that it can be very prone to the subjective experience of the asylum official, and what they deem to be implausible might very well be plausible in another cultural context altogether. And we see here two examples of how applicants were found to either react implausibly or behave irrationally in some way. And some of these plausibility assessments concerned not only the individual applicant, but also how their society at large is expected to be. So, for example, in one decision, the applicant stated that, or the decision stated that you have also been asked how you experience the relationship between your religion and your sexuality, and you have responded narrowly that you do not see it as a problem because although you're a Muslim, you do not practice Islam. So here this underlies obviously the assumption that no matter how religious you are, even someone who only identifies as Muslim in name should be capable of perceiving a conflict between these two identity facets. And similarly, here another applicant was denied because even though they came from a family background that was more liberal than the average or the normal Iraqi family, the immigration service found that the applicant should be able to describe the conflicts connected to their sexual orientation. So clearly, even coming from a smaller fragment of society that is accepting or supportive of the applicant was not found as a valid justification for shielding the applicant against developing internalized homophobia. And this again shows a very essentialist understanding of Iraqi society in this case, and of Islam or individuals who identify as Muslim. Now, I've shown some of the findings from our and assumptions in the decisions, but I wanted to also highlight what we looked at when we analyzed the interview transcripts. So we categorized a total of 13,000 interview questions across 129 cases to identify how they were formulated. And we classified them either as open-ended, so these were questions that were formulated such as, tell me how you fled your home country, or tell me more about the reasons why you left your home country. And these are considered in the investigative interviewing literature to be optimal in terms of gathering relevant evidence. Then the second category are so-called focused questions, which are the W questions. So what, when, how, where, which are not necessarily problematic, but including too many of these can restrict applicants' accounts and can also convey the impression that the interview takes on more of an interrogation tone. So they should be limited to a large extent, or at least they should follow the open-ended questions. And finally, we also identified the third category, which are the most unrecommended question types. And these are questions that severely restrict the applicant's account, so those which ask yes or no questions or force the applicant between two answer options, or, in the most alarming cases, those that either confuse the applicant or lead them into, strongly suggest what kind of answer is expected. So we found that only 12% of all interview questions were formulated as open-ended questions, which is clearly problematic. On the other hand, more than half of questions were focused who, what, when, where, why questions. And 33% of all questions were classified as unrecommended. And here I provide some examples of the most problematic examples. Like, for example, so at no point did you want to change yourself or try to be with girls. This clearly suggests an expectation that the official holds and also conveys a value judgment on the part of the asylum official. One may think that in a situation like this, one could be perceived as an outsider. One would feel like an outsider. Again, how can an applicant be reasonably expected to answer no to a question like this? So, of course, one of our recommendations to the Finnish Immigration Service, throughout not only this study, but previous studies that my colleagues have done as well, is to eliminate entirely these questions which strongly suggest what kind of answer is expected or convey a clear value judgment on the part of the official. And finally, on to our third research question, which was, what reasons do applicants or claimants provide for delaying the disclosure of their sexual orientation? Here, we went through all of the interview transcripts in the 129 cases that we analyzed, and we looked for questions where the official had explicitly asked the applicant to clarify the delay in disclosing their sexual orientation. And we found that the most common reason was not knowing that sexual orientation could be a ground for asylum. So many applicants had applied based on grounds of generalized violence or due to their religious affiliation in a country where there was a conflict between different religious groups, without knowing that their individual profile would be at risk or that they qualified for international protection based on their sexual orientation. And an alarming quarter of all applicants cited one of the professionals involved in the asylum procedure. And I'm not referring to legal representatives here, but specifically the three participants in either the registration interview or the asylum interview itself. So they explicitly named one of the professionals as a barrier to their disclosure. Many believe that the presence of the interpreter, although essential, made them call into question the confidentiality of the interview, and that encountering someone from their own community severely restricted their ability to provide their account, because they felt like the interpreter also held a value judgment over their sexual minority status. And in terms of the consequences of the delay in disclosure, we found that officials tended to focus excessively on the procedural safeguards that were in place in the interview. And by that, I mean that many of them cited the explicit applicant's right to confidentiality as something that should have made them feel comfortable, without considering barriers to disclosure that had to do with the claimant's past experience of harm at the hands of authority figures, which could then spill over into the asylum interview and prevent them from opening up to a person in a position of power. And then many officials also cited the fact that they had clearly asked the applicant at the end of their first interview, do you have any other reasons to apply for asylum? And to which they had answered no, as a reason to reject their claim. And when we compare this to the large number of applicants who were not aware that this could be a ground for seeking asylum, it becomes quite problematic. So to sum up, I would say the takeaway messages, or the main findings here, is that the expected level of detail, which is apparent in the asylum procedure in Finland, is at odds with the current formulation of interview questions, which don't necessarily encourage the applicant to open up and provide all of the information at their disposal. And a second important finding is that this expectation of timely disclosure doesn't necessarily account for the main barriers to disclosure that applicants hold, which are their lack of knowledge about the asylum system and the criteria for being granted asylum, as well as certain factors related to how they perceive the other professionals involved in the asylum framework. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ine Mavot. I'm from Belgium, and I work at Nansen, the Belgian Refugee Council. I will present you my paper today that specifically focuses on Afghan gay men in Belgium and the assessment of their protection needs. First, I will give you a little bit of context on this paper and why this theme. So Afghan applicants for international protection in Belgium face a really high refusal rate and an unreasonable burden of proof, and those applying for international protection because of their sexual orientation face some additional difficulties, because some of them receive a negative decision because they would only have sexual acts or perform sexual relationships, but they would not have a real sexual orientation. And the question that I then asked is how this distinction between those two things is made in practice. And in the first part, I will discuss this a little bit further based on a case law analysis that I conducted. And then in the second part, I will argument that there might still be a need for international protection for these Afghan men. And this part is divided into two sections. In the first section, I will argument that it's difficult to really distinguish between a real sexual orientation and only sexual practices. And then in the second part, I will argue that even though that there are only, in the words of the asylum authorities, only sexual practices, there might still be this need for international protection. First, I will shortly introduce the organization I work for, Nansen. So Nansen is the Belgian Refugee Council, and we are a center of legal expertise on international protection. And we are also an implementing partner of UNHCR in Belgium. And mainly we have two lines of activities. So first of all, we work in individual cases, and there we really support the lawyers. So we are no lawyers ourselves, but we support the lawyers. And we also intervene before the asylum authorities officially. And then secondly, we also provide trainings and publications for lawyers, such as this publication, really based on the work we do in the individual cases and the things we notice in individual cases. So the paper I'm presenting today is also really starting from these individual cases. And now I will give a little bit of context on the Belgium asylum system so that you all understand everything what I'm talking about today. So the first instance decision body in Belgium is called the CJRS, or the Office of the Commissioner General for Refugees and Stateless Persons. And then we have the administrative appeal body that is called the CAL, the Council for Alien Law Litigation. And this paper is based on the decisions of the CAL, but that means also on the decisions of the CJRS, the first instance decision body, because those are contained in the decisions of the CAL. A little bit of nuance on this paper is that the positive decisions of the CJRS are not motivated, so we don't have this background and we don't know why a decision is positive. So that's good to know also and to nuance a little bit the presentation today. And then in addition, I also want to say that I do not pretend to be complete today. So I know a lot of you have a lot of experience in this area. So if you have any suggestions or experiences from your own practice, please do not hesitate to share them later. So now I will give a short overview of the case law analysis that I conducted and thus on the asylum authorities' reasoning. And in short, the reasoning followed by the asylum authorities is that a distinction should be made between sexual practices, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. And if we read the decisions of the CJRS and of the CAL, then we can see that this is based on the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. So I will now briefly refresh this case law for you, because in the joint cases XYZ, the Court of Justice clarified the definition of a particular social group. And the definition, you can see it on the slide, is in Article 10 of the Qualification Directive. And it states that a group shall be considered to form a particular social group. And then it has 2 points where it proceeds with in particular. And then it says that the group should share a characteristic that is fundamental to identity. I'm just explaining it shortly. And then that the group has a distinct identity in the relevant country. And thus, here you see the Court of Justice reasoning based on this definition. So the court has ruled in this decision that to be a particular social group, both conditions must be fulfilled from this definition, and thus the conditions should be understood as cumulative and not as alternative. So this has been discussed, and I will present it to you later also. But thus, according to the court, to be a particular social group, you always need to share a characteristic that is fundamental to identity. And that's really important in this reasoning of the Belgian asylum authorities, because based on this case law, the Belgian asylum authorities will judge that a distinction should be made between sexual practices, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. And if a person only performs sexual practices, they do not constitute a social group because the characteristic is not fundamental to the person's identity, and therefore that person does not need protection and does not fear persecution and can just return to Afghanistan. So the question that I then ask is how it is decided in practice that an applicant does not demonstrate a sexual orientation or a credible sexual orientation, but does only demonstrate that he is having sexual practices or engaging in sexual practices. And for that, I have analyzed the decisions of the asylum authorities, and I have gathered the most common arguments on the slides, but we have discussed them already earlier. I think it's coming back in a lot of countries. So I will shortly discuss them with you now. So the first argument that is used is that the description of the awareness process of the sexual orientation is vague. Secondly, they also base their decisions on the previous relationships of the person and the statements about these previous relationships. And they are presented as being rather superficial and lacking in depth. And then third, the statements about the homosexual experiences would be rather limited to the sexual aspect and don't go any further and lack really emotional involvement. And then fourth, the asylum authorities in Belgium also decide on the basis of the knowledge of the person of the LGBTQ community, either in Afghanistan or in Belgium. Thus, a little summary of the decisions. They base on these arguments, they base that the sexual orientation is not credible, but that there might be sexual practices taking place, but that is not a fundamental part of the identity of the person, so there is no particular social group, and thus there is no need for international protection. And now I will try to argument with you why there might still be this need for international protection for these Afghan men. And in this first part, I want to give the message that it's really difficult to distinguish between those two, and that I think that the reasoning of the asylum authorities, as we have already discussed, is too often based on stereotypical assumptions and reasonings. So here I'm really trying to put into perspective the arguments that I have just gone over. And today I will only analyze with you the third argument because we don't have a lot of time, and this is also the argument that has been least discussed already in research, and the other arguments have already been the subject of a lot of international and Belgian research. So the argument that I'm discussing is thus that the declarations of the person are too limited to the sexual aspect. And in this argument, we have identified three reasonings that are really stereotypical. And the first one you can see on the slide is that it assumes that persons applying for international protection because of their sexual orientation can easily talk about the feelings that go with that and that are involved in it. But contrary to that, due to feelings of shame, it may be really difficult to talk about sexuality in general for the person, also because the person hasn't talked about it much in the past. It might be really difficult to at once disclose it all. And then on the other hand, for some persons, it might be easier to talk about sexual acts than to talk about real inner feelings, because they haven't talked about it yet. It might be difficult to know what you're feeling inside of you, and that it might be easier to talk about the things you're doing. A second stereotypical reasoning we can identify is that this argument really assumes a Western view of sexuality, where emotional commitment and inner feelings are central to the sexuality, and that you really experience this Western love. But there is not just one view of sexuality, and that is something you can also see on the quote on the slide. Sexuality can really take a lot of different meanings into a person's life. So that's a really difficult argument to take. And also, besides that, the personal background of the person, the class, education, the social status may all affect whether there can be this emotional involvement and emotional journey to self-realization and awareness. And then third, this reasoning is also based on a Western Orientalist view of sexuality in Afghanistan, of course, which assumes that sex between men is a common thing in Afghanistan as opposed to real homosexual relationships. And on the slide, you can see an example of such reasoning of the CJRS, so that's the first instance decision body. And it says that a distinction is made in Afghanistan between homosexuals and bisexuals, and on the other hand, men who only have sexual contacts with men, yes. And then in the end, you see male-to-male sex in Afghanistan is an unusual practice independent of any sexual orientation. So this is an idea that is not only reflected in the decisions of the asylum authorities, but it's also dominated in the Western media. So the Western media also reports on Afghanistan and sexuality in Afghanistan by the same reasonings. And behind this is actually the deprivation hypothesis, being that men turn to other men in Afghanistan out of desperation, sexual desperation, because women are scarce. And therefore, there are only a few authentic gay men in Afghanistan, and all the rest is just having sex with men because they can't have sex with women. And this is, according to us, a really debatable view that also the Belgian asylum authorities adopt in their decisions, and it's based on a European ethnocentrism and a real Orientalist way of thinking. So based on these stereotypes and assumptions, we argue that there might still be a need for international protection because of the sexual orientation of the person. And then now I will look at the other side, and I want to elaborate on the fact that even if the person has only or only performs sexual acts, there might still be this need for international protection. So when I say only sexual acts, it's in the words of the asylum authorities, of course. And in support of this, I will give 3 arguments. So first, these persons may have a fear of persecution because of the attributed sexual orientation. And for this, we again look at Article 10 of the Qualification Directive that says that a person can demonstrate a fear of persecution even if the person is not actually a member of a particular social group, but if this characteristic is attributed to the person by the actor of persecution. So when we apply this article to the situation I'm discussing right now, men who have sexual relationships with other men in Afghanistan might be viewed as homosexual by the actor of persecution. And for this reason, we could argue that they face a similar risk and thus also have a similar need for international protection. A second argument is based on the UNHCR guidelines number 9. So, as I said earlier, the European Court of Justice states that the conditions of a particular social group should be understood as being cumulative. And in fact, UNHCR argues that these should not be understood as cumulative, but as alternative. So UNHCR guidelines imply that a social group can also be a group that just has a distinct identity in the country of origin. And then men who only perform sexual acts with other men could also have this need for international protection based on the identity of or the social group criterion, making them, because they have this own identity in Afghanistan, making them also a social group and demonstrating a fear of persecution. And then the third and last way of arguing that a man who only have sexual relations also needs international protection is by putting forward other grounds of persecution, because as we all know, the 5 grounds aren't exclusive and they may overlap. And usually applications for international protection because of the sexual orientation are looked at under the membership of a particular social group, but also the other grounds may be relevant. And this is also stated by UNHCR in the guidelines number 9. So when we apply this to Afghan men who only engage in homosexual acts, this means that their claims should also be analyzed from the perspective of other persecution grounds. For example, when we take political opinion, we all know since the Taliban takeover in 2021 that it's really unclear what is happening there, but what is clear is that there are really severe punishments and strict rules applied for homosexual men, and when those men engage in homosexual acts, they will be looked at as being homosexual and part of the LGBTQ community. Thus, they may fear the same risk of persecution as others of the LGBTQ community. So that's where the 3 arguments for the fact that even if there are only sexual practices, there might still be this need for international protection. And I want to conclude very briefly by acknowledging that the assessment of the credibility of the sexual orientation is really not easy, but that it needs to happen in a more objective, individual, and culturally sensitive way, with the self-identification of the person as a starting point. And then I just want to give you some useful resources and tools from Nansen, and also the link to a project that we are having right now, specifically focusing on LGBTQI persons in the asylum procedure. And then I just want to thank you for listening, and if you have any examples from your own practice, please do not hesitate to share them later today. And I also want to thank the organizers for the interesting conference. Thank you.
Hi. I'm just going to get water because I have a huge lump in my throat. Let's see. So this is my paper, which is drawing from the findings of Queer Sarita. Sarita, which stands for Sexual and Gender-Based Violence from Displacement to Arrival, is a project at the University of Birmingham in conjunction with universities of Melbourne, Bilkent, and Uppsala. And over the past 6 years, we've been mapping incidents and experiences of SGBV across the refugee journey. And just to kind of give you a bit of background to Queer Sarita, the initial findings from the original Sarita project did find that, that queer communities experience SGBV in very distinct ways from heterosexual and cisgendered populations, but we only had a very small amount of data, so we wanted to go back and find more and just see and kind of confirm these initial findings. And so this project addressed this deficit in the knowledge in the UK context. But I should just kind of, for full disclosure, this isn't really a very technical presentation on SOGI claims. It's more looking at the impact of expectations of performance and participation, like under current asylum-seeking, asylum system conditions in the UK. So why the conditions make it so impossible to kind of do this performance and participate in the way that is expected by the Home Office. So anyway, so sorry if this is not the technical presentation you're after. So just quickly about the methods. We conducted interviews between August 2023 and April 2024. We spoke to 10 service users and 14 service providers, and we reanalyzed 5 further transcripts from the original Sarita project with more of a queer lens. And the service providers we spoke to were majority specialists, LGBT refugee support services. And they were drawn from across the UK. So there are 6 in England, 3 in Northern Ireland, 4 in Wales, and 1 in Scotland. And it's just worth noting that in the UK, asylum policy is set in Westminster, but there isn't like the different devolved nations don't have any influence on asylum policy, but they do. They can set particular policy on like integration or like trafficking support. So there are nuances, and we tried to capture that within the study. The interviews explored experiences across the journey of forced migration. So we looked at access to services and support, experiences of the UK system, factors creating risk and resilience, and what is needed, like what isn't there that's needed, and how those experiences have impacted ability to build a life in the UK. And I wanted to start with this image, which was taken by the Belfast-based photographer Brendan Harkin, and it shows so Rainbow Refugees Northern Ireland. They were participants to the study. They gave permission for me to use this and to talk about them. But it shows Rainbow Refugees leading Pride, Belfast Pride in 2022, which was like a huge deal, a massive source of like pride and excitement for those service users. But it was also fraught with anxiety because, and as you can see, many opted to wear these masks that they made to protect their identity while they were taking part in the parade because they felt it was unsafe to identify themselves publicly as queer. And so even though it was like it was about protecting your identity, they tried to create a celebration out of these masks. So they were made in this Mardi Gras style. They're kind of both a celebration and a protest that they had to hide their identities. They were as they were made, and they made like a whole kind of event of making them. But as they were made, the process of making these masks was being documented really carefully by the volunteers at Rainbow Refugees, because they knew that they needed that evidence. Like, this is a rare source of evidence to show their participation in queer culture. So, and I just felt like this image, which we used for the cover of the report, it really illustrated the complexity of being visibly out for asylum seekers, and that tension between engaging with queer culture and activity while keeping yourself safe in the process. Our research found that there was really good reason for fearing exposure within the UK asylum system. The asylum accommodation was described as a living nightmare for many people. Asylum, I don't know if you know, in the UK, asylum accommodation is provided on a no-choice basis. You can be moved at any time. It's often in houses of multiple occupancy or hostel-style accommodation. There is only there is a small number of bed spaces available in England provided by Micro Rainbow that's LGBT specific, but these are very few and far between. And the experiences of people in asylum accommodation range from discomfort and fear of outing to homophobic and transphobic harassment, physical attack, and sexual assault. And this was perpetrated by other residents, but also staff. There was also a real lack of specific safeguarding assessment of queer people in asylum accommodation and just across the asylum system. Even though there was a knowledge that this is an issue, that there is a real risk of attack. And our respondents described how when reports were made of attacks to staff, that no action was taken, or it just escalated the situation, it escalated the harassment they were experiencing. There was also a recent increase in room sharing, which made it even harder to sort of hide your identity, to sort of keep those, like, especially if you're having to gather evidence for the Home Office, like these pictures that you saw. There was, less places to hide it. We had trans women who would keep their dresses and their high heels locked in a suitcase under their bed, with fearing that anyone would find it. And if you're having to share a room with other people, that's an absolutely impossible situation. There are also threats not only in accommodation but from co-ethnic communities. And particularly in the co-ethnic communities can be small, particularly in smaller cities, so outside of London, and they're very well connected through social media, but both within the UK and home countries. So if word gets out, word can spread very quickly, so both within those communities and at home. And there was one respondent was an East African who lived in a very small city, and his trouble started at the hairdresser, the only African hairdresser in this place, where they noticed some a bit of nail varnish left on his hands, and then this escalated to being completely shunned by the community, where it got back to his accommodation, and things just escalated for him from there. We had another respondent who talks about having to leave Germany and to come to the UK because there's too many Syrians in Germany, and it just didn't feel safe for him. And this vulnerability was also heightened by intersections of race and performance of gender identity. So trans women, or kind of those sort of seen to transcend the performances of gender, were particularly at risk and seen as almost fair game. And I just wanted to go to this quote, which I think really sums up the predicament of people living in the asylum system in the UK, and asylum accommodation, and just that the impact of that lack of safeguarding procedures. So I can read it out. It's like really, it's too small there and it's too big here. It was also in the first place that I lived that I was placed. I was being sexually harassed by one of the others who lived there, by one of the other asylum seekers. And it was really difficult because for the longest time, I didn't feel that I could say anything about it. I was scared in case the other people in the house would turn on me as I spoke the same language as this person. I was scared that it might affect my asylum case negatively. I was scared that it was somehow my fault, and that I had caused this. And so for the longest time, I couldn't talk to anyone. And when I did, when I finally spoke to the G4S housing officer about it, they weren't very helpful, to be honest. So it's just the different layers of difficulty. So on a sort of practical level, just the fear that you experience, the lack of safeguarding, and also just those feelings of shame and the psychology of actually making these, asking for help. And one of the issues really that we came across was in the research was one of our big findings was that the UK asylum system is hetero and homonormative and actively homophobic. So it's not just a passive, but it's an active homophobia. And you can see, it's not just the unsafe accommodation and the lack of safeguarding, but there are sort of these, on the right-hand side, there are some really horrific examples of active homophobia perpetrated by staff, by other interpreters. There was a terrible example of official support literature that was given to everyone that was translated into Arabic, and the Arabic translation included a homophobic slur, but these aren't being checked. So when you're being given this, and it's the information that you have for support as an LGBT asylum seeker, and you're actually being faced with abuse, like in that written document. So I just wanted to go on to just a lot of this we've kind of covered so much in this, over the course of the day, but the complexity of providing evidence to support asylum claims based on gender or sexual diversity. One of the, we talk a lot about the narrative accounts for the lack of evidence, but we had a recent bill or act in the UK in 2022, the Nationality and Borders Act, which increased that standard of proof required, so it's even higher in the UK now, which has an unfair impact on SOGIES cases. And also the fact that Home Office processes don't take account of underlying trauma, that fear of exposure, or that lack of common language to describe sexual or gender diversity. So we had a respondent who was a lesbian who thought she was bisexual because she'd been forced to marry a man, and then she had her credibility questioned when she better understood the terminology and tried to change her story. And just also sort of talking about sensitive or culturally taboo topics in a hostile and dehumanizing way, being asked inappropriate questions. And again, like this, like having cases assessed against Eurocentric stereotypes of queerness. There was also an institutional ignorance of queer forced migrant experiences. So we had an example of a lesbian who was asked by a judge, in fact, for a girlfriend's death certificate, when the relationship wasn't even legal, like let alone official. So just the kind of the total lack of, of basic knowledge and understanding of those lived experiences. And then there's a couple of quotes. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes, okay. A couple of quotes about that sort of sum up that hetero and homonormativity and homophobia. I guess the one most, I'll draw your attention to the second one, which is from a specialist lawyer in Northern Ireland, who says, as if someone has a knowledge of a point or a point in time, And if they don't answer those in a certain format, then they're said to have their credibility damaged. And that damages their case, and it's not just really bad measurement of the reality of a human who's coming to terms with their sexuality that they may or not even fully have realized, and in circumstances where they come from a background where it's not legal, encouraged, or celebrated. So my final area I wanted to just touch on is like how these expectations of performance within this system creates vulnerability to SGBV. And one of the big issues that we came across was relationships, and this pressure to be in a relationship because it's a rare form of proof of for your asylum claim. You know, in the way that kind of it's like the only thing you have that's not that narrative of coming out. And we found in the research that queer people in the asylum system are uniquely vulnerable in relationships. And that's for a number of reasons. They have this relationship history that's shaped by the violence of the state and cultural taboos. Often, like authentic relationships that they would have had would have to be carried out in secret under the threat of harm or death or prison, or relationships were just avoided altogether. So a lot of respondents were very inexperienced within relationships when they came to the UK. And they also had histories that sort of shaped the type of relationships that they felt they deserve, so that, you know, just all wrapped up in that shame and that discomfort, or that like not yet being comfortable in your own skin. And that pressure to be in a relationship can make, we've found, like made our respondents like uniquely vulnerable to intimate partner violence, exploitative, or sort of, you know, relationships where there's a real power imbalance, where there's like a need to stay in the relationship for the sake of your claim, and that sort of risk of immigration like control. But also the issue of social isolation and that lack of social capital that we find a lot of queer people in the asylum system experience. So like relationships like provide a source of social capital, or safer accommodation, or respite from the enforced poverty that you experience in the asylum system. So you might have, you know, somebody who has a job, who has some money, and the combination of these factors make queer people seeking asylum, more healthy to power dynamics. Sorry, but there's also just the lack of support of co-ethnic communities and places of worship. There's resources that a lot of like non-queer asylum seekers can draw on. Sorry. And there was a lot of people who were wary of like attending any groups that weren't guaranteed to be safe spaces, or spaces where they may risk exposure. And then there was just finally like just another way that you're sort of uniquely vulnerable is through like the lack of trust in police due to adverse experiences at home, or just a lack of awareness of legal protections around hate crimes, which would lead to adverse experiences going unreported. So just to conclude, this is a mixture of conclusions and some of the recommendations that came out of our research. Again, it's really hard to read it there. It's really too big here. So to conclude, queer people in the UK asylum system face distinct risks to SGBV compared to heterosexual cisgendered populations. The UK asylum system presents a impossible paradox for those in the system, which requires that they're simultaneously visible and invisible. So visible for the sake of their claim, and invisible for the sake of their safety. And then, the rest are just some of some of our recommendations come out of the report. That's probably enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip. If all speakers please come up forward so we all can see you. And then, of course, yeah, well, that's good to see. 4 hands already. I have the instructions that we all have to speak in the microphone. So I give the pink one to the speakers. Let me start with you, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Asta. Okay, so I have, may I take the liberty of asking 2 questions? Okay. Oh. Okay, I'm going to go with the first one for Jess. So I was interested. So thank you. This was super cool and very impressive for also like undergrad and master research. But I was wondering, like, how often the phone readouts are actually being conducted, and also to what extent they are actually being used. In asylum cases. For context, it is procedure in Denmark to do readout of phones. It's done almost consequently, but it's rarely really used because of lack of expertise. Yeah, so I was just wondering what is the, what's the situation? Thank you. Oh, that's for Harriet. And that's just, when you talk about credibility, how do you define it? Is it credibility in terms of like, do we believe that you are queer? Or is it also like credibility in terms of, is your fear of persecution well-founded? Thank you.
Do I start now? For how often phones are used in the messaging history, what I used was the Tribunal database site, so you could type in keywords. So it was really difficult to actually narrow down the specific cases. So I was typing in words like smartphone, digital evidence, messaging history, even keywords like WhatsApp, Grindr, Adam for Adam, like trying to find the specific cases. So I think I analysed about 15 cases for that dissertation. But I think it'd be really interesting to try and do more of like a wider search to see how often, because I really would love to compare how the digital evidence is used for non-SOGI cases as well. But I don't know if I can answer that without going through all the data, but from what I can see, it was quite frequent, and it was in the appeal processes. It was when your testimonial evidence wasn't enough, that was where they went next. And again, they were used to confirm a relationship in most senses rather than anything else. It was more to confirm that you were in a same-sex relationship over anything like a location or anything. It was more to see the words like I showed with the emojis and the terms of endearment. That seems to be how they were used across the board of the ones I looked at. But yeah, it's a large database and it's quite difficult to navigate, so I need to have a bit more of a look on that one.
Thanks, Asta, for the question. So we looked at credibility of the claim as a whole, and I wasn't able to present all of my results, but it's good that you pointed this out. We actually found that the credibility of past instances of persecution was more likely to be accepted than that of the applicant's stated sexual orientation. That was quite a noteworthy finding as well. So they're more skeptical of the applicant's identity than accounts of harm in the country of origin.
Thank you. That's a good addition. You had a question, no? Yeah, then we go.
Hey, my name is Miriam Suryanin. I've worked here in the Netherlands around these topics, like around legal age for queer asylum seekers and undocumented people for about 4 or 5 years now. First of all, thank you, panelists, for like brilliant talks. My question and also encouragement to talk to Jeve. It was really brilliant to see you engage with the very similar legal topics that vary also from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, like, for example, Jana Wessels makes known in her work. So I would recommend also guiding towards that direction when approaching it. But I just wanted to, I had a note regarding, have you considered how the first condition, or like how sexual practices, how there is an expectation to, do you think there's a expectation to connect sexual acts, behavior, and also forms of evidence as like meaningful in order for them to substantiate, like meaningful to the applicants themselves, in order for them to then be taken into account as like evidence that substantiate, or like evidence or account that then like holds relevance over the sexual orientation of the applicant, such as the applicant giving meaning to perform sexual acts that then, connects that to sexual orientation. Does it make sense?
I think so. So, if I may ask, do you mean that, on the other hand, people aren't believed if they don't give, or if they don't explain their sexual orientation using these sexual performances? Like what does sexual practices mean for proving sexual orientation? That's what you mean, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, is it a requirement for applicants to explicitly connect sexual acts and practices to like find them meaningful to uphold this form of identity, like a sexual orientation may be considered in the Belgian context?
Yes. So that's a little bit of a contradiction in my head, because on the one hand you have, like what I presented, that some aspects are not believed when you talk too much, not only when you talk too much about the sexual practices, but on the other hand, with other asylum seekers, it happens that when the person doesn't talk about sexual practices or sexuality in general, it's also incredible, because the person hasn't thought about being sexual, performing the sexuality and the sexual orientation. So, but that is what is happening a lot, I think, that on the one hand, it's used against the person, but on the other hand, if you explain about it and if you use it in your asylum claim, it's also used against the person. So it's not because you perform your sexual orientation and you perform sexual practices that your sexual orientation will be believed, but on the other hand, when you don't talk about it, it's not necessarily credible.
Thank you.
Is that an answer? I'm sorry, it's maybe a little bit. Thank you.
Well, I did see here a red line with the conclusion of expectations in the presentation of Hedayat, the expectation of knowledge and the expectation of proof.
Thank you. Aino Gröndal from Sweden and with RFSL, but also as part of the Striking Sirens Coalition. I just want to begin with saying thank you. I've read all of your papers, and every single time I sit and read them, I just feel like, wow, I recognize this. We have exactly the same situation in Sweden, so really thank you. And we are so privileged to have your papers, and I really think we are going to be able to do something great with it. So I just want to say thank you. I want to say so many things to all of you and ask questions and have conversations, but there is no time. I just wanted to say about, we have this thing in Sweden, which I also wrote a whole chapter in my research, which is now in English. So if you want to read that, you're welcome. But I chose to call it something like dividing identity and practices, and because the problem, so to say, is the same in Sweden. What I found was that in the Swedish migration courts, it happens that they sort of believe, if you call that, or they find it to be credible that a person has same sexual relations, but that they write in their judgments that same-sex relations are not protection worthy. And for a lawyer, like, I find that very, very odd, because in places like Afghanistan, for example, like the Taliban or the regime, they don't care about your feelings. They don't care about an inner process. It's completely irrelevant. What is punishable with death is the very sexual relations between men. So of course they are protection worthy. So that's, yeah. And I haven't met any, like, nobody has argued against that when I talk about that in Sweden. So yeah, but I try to highlight that in my chapter as well. Just a tip.
Exactly, and also the asylum seekers themselves, that's also the way that they are explaining their situation, is by, when I go back, I will be punished, I will be persecuted, and I will die. And how can you not believe, or how can the Belgian asylum authorities not believe that, or not see that it's not, it's like an artificial distinction between two things, but both of them, they need protection, and yeah, it's hard to reason in the heads of the asylum authorities, I think.
I do see another question in the back, and I get back to you, but I take my position as a chair to come in the discussion here, because I'm quite curious. I do recognize discussions in the Netherlands, and there's a recent judgment from the Court of Justice on it's on female and the belief in gender equality. KNL, it's from the 11th of June. It's also on the definition of a particular social group. So I would be curious to hear from other member states how the discussion on this judgment evolves, what it could mean for SOGI asylum claims. As we are discussing, if the discussion is not moving from defining a social group towards the more the risk, the threat of persecution. So think about that maybe from different countries, and then I will move to another question.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Kane Youngman. I'm a Botswana national living in Brussels. It seems like this week is my week to be, I can call it a shocking week, because I've just come from a conference in Nepal for Swana region, Southwest Asia and North Africa region, where we're talking about LGBTI rights. And I must admit that it's been 4 full days of saying throughout with my mouth open, and it seems like it's continuing here. So, living in Brussels, I chose to move to Brussels not for asylum reasons, for my own personal reasons. And I've always wondered why the individuals from troublesome countries who are in Brussels seeking asylum were always in the forefront of the Pride March. So now it explains your presentations and everybody what they've been saying, the need for evidence, the need to build evidence for asylum status. It makes sense. And in my head, I'm thinking, somebody mentioned it's like €8, you get €8 or £8 per week. And I'm thinking to myself, I work and I can't even afford to buy merchandise at Pride. So I can imagine with the poor individuals who have to buy all of this, drape themselves on all rainbow colors. If somebody likes wearing black, so that means now they have to act. You have to become one of those Oscar or whatever highly based actors to put yourself like you're an actor. Wear all the rainbow colors, hold the flags and everything, things that you don't do in your own comfort zone. So I talked to one of the asylum seekers in Brussels at the Rainbow House. It's like, why are you here? You look like you're not enjoying it. It's like, I have to because I'm still working on my asylum case. I didn't get it. I didn't understand what they meant. So now, thank you very much for sharing all of this because it makes sense. And then my other comrade who worked with the Egypt, I worked with projects from Egypt. So as all of you guys were presenting, sharing your things, and they're thinking, with the project individuals, implementers that I work with in Egypt, it seems like it's a catch-22 to where you're seeking asylum, they demand evidence. In Egypt, when they catch you with that evidence, you get prosecuted. So two of the comrades who were supposed to be coming to this meeting were held and interrogated by the police. First day for 4 hours, second day for 9 hours, and then they had to come for the third day, just by leaving the country, without even saying anything, posting anything. Authorities stopping you, and then they seize their phones. So usually when one person gets arrested, all of them who are involved in the movement, they clear their phones. They clear their phones, they clear their laptop. So where are you going to get this if you have cleared everything? Because with it, you get prosecuted or you get killed. Without it, you can't get asylum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So maybe we first Pip can react, because I think the first part of the question relates a lot to your research.
Yeah, I mean, we had some other points in the research that I didn't sort of talk about. Was there would be just to kind of like, you know, come after your point about Pride and participation in Pride. So that we'd have support groups, so queer refugee support groups who would obtain some wristbands for the paid areas of Pride. I don't know if it's like this in Europe, but in a lot of the UK, Pride is behind a big wall that you can only participate in if you pay like £50 for the weekend. I mean, it's really, really expensive. So the group would be given like a couple of wristbands or wristbands for members for sort of service users. And they describe getting there and getting inside, and it's really busy and it's loud and people are drinking, and you know they have to, you know, they have no money to buy. Like one says, like, well, I was hungry and I wasn't able to buy any food there because it's, you know, it's like £10 for a burger or something. So I just went home, and you know, so it really is like this expectation that you participate in this world that's really not, I mean, for a lot of queer people here, it's like, you know, that's not really our world, you know, that's a very, you know, that's a very specific part of Pride, of LGBT culture. But really it just doesn't translate to them, and it's weird to be expected to, you know, to be part of that. They kind of do it because that's what they're meant to do, but they also don't really feel like they belong there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. I should mention that currently my research focuses strictly on Finland, but since you mentioned Egypt, it's quite a paradoxical situation in the sense that Egypt is both a country of origin and of destination for asylum seekers. And UNHCR has mandate to conduct refugee adjudication in Egypt because of an absence of a national framework for asylum. So what tends to, and the Egyptian government is bound by to respect individual decisions on asylum, so that recognized refugees are protected from refoulement from Egypt if their application is accepted. But it's quite dangerous for queer applicants in Egypt, because even though they can be recognized, they continue to face both discrimination and persecution in Egypt, which makes it necessary to evaluate the eligibility of individual refugees for resettlement to a safe third country. So just a note regarding your comment about Egypt there. Thank you so much.
Yes, I think there's a final question, if I see the time.
Thank you. So I'm going to piggyback off of this gentleman's question about the double bind of having too much evidence or no evidence. And I would like to kind of open this up for all of you, but particularly Jess, because you're talking about digital, right? I'm just curious if any of you have run across any jurisdictions, asylum system where two things. You mentioned, Jess, that there might be a possibility for artificial intelligence to be having a role. So beyond the assessment of emojis, but actually looking at credibility. Have you come across anything like that in your work with the Home Office?
Not in my work, but there's a paper I read where someone looked at the introduction of digital interpreters and how that would affect credibility, because if you're using digitized forms of interpreters rather than an actual interpreter who can understand nuance in language and emotion, it's how language then can be distorted, and that was an effect of digitization coming into the asylum system. That wasn't in the UK, but I can point you to the paper I read afterwards. I think we were talking about this over lunch.
Yes, or in Belgium, there are rumors, but it's like a small rumor that it might be used, artificial intelligence might be used to transcribe the interviews, so not to analyze the interviews, but to just with an automatical transcriber to transcribe them, and afterwards I hope they would be read by the protection officer or the interviewer. But there were rumors because of an interview where there were absurd things that weren't said during the interview, that you might think that a transcriber might be used, but it's not something that's been researched already, I think.
Just to add to that, we in the UK there are huge issues with interpreters, and it's not the interpreters being actively homophobic, but also the fear of interpreters. So people not feeling like they don't trust this interpreter who's from their home country, and that word might get back. And there's a real fear, because if you are exposed and then you are refused and you are sent home, then you could be killed. And so actually, this is like an issue I think that we're grappling with a lot in the UK, is like how, what kind of specially trained team would look like. And perhaps AI is a way around that, where you don't have, judgment.
I was going to say on AI as well, with photographs, I think what I'm thinking is it gives them another excuse to deem something insufficient. It just adds to this, like, oh, well, it could have been falsely generated using AI. Your transcript, your story could have been falsely generated on ChatGPT. It could have been a photograph of you outside Pride made, by AI. I think it just gives them another reason to say something is insufficient or incredible. And yeah, I think that's really important to know.
Yeah, I only can add from the Netherlands that we know that there is a AI tool in use by the immigration authorities, and it's called Case Matcher. That's the way it's registered. But we have very little insight in what way it's used. It's a way to compare cases, to compare stories easily. And it's built by an external technical company. And I know I hear some talking in the back, so we know very little of it further, as it's in the registration of AI instrument used by the governments, but we know very little in how it is used in practice of immigration cases. Yeah? Some additions? I thought we have to finish, but I think the other groups are also still discussing, so that gives you room for the really final.
So it's not a question as such, it's just a stupid comment on my part. So allow me to be, allow me to be foolish a bit, because in terms of relationships, somebody mentioned people are kind of forced to formulate this relationship or to get into these relationships. And also and you're expected to produce this evidence that you have these relationships, pictures and everything. And I'm there sitting to myself wondering, I have about 3 exes or so, and I'm like, do I even have pictures with them? And I'm thinking to myself, and then I'm like, I'm from a culture where if you didn't know your parents were your parents, you would wonder if these two were dating. But they never show any intimacy. That means pictures and everything are out of the question. Intimacy out of the question. they don't show any intimacy, but 1, 2, 3, they have 6 children, and you're wondering when did that happen? So now I'm wondering about in the context of producing evidence relationships, because not all of us showcase our relationships. So some of us, like in our culture, where I come from, you would never know if you were not told that this person is in a relationship with that person. You would not see it because they don't show any intimacy or affection towards each other. But you will know because they have 7 kids.
I think that is the problem, though, because if you're, again, what I was trying to say, and that is if you're having to go to these extreme measures and photographs are now what is deemed an acceptable form as evidence, you're going to be then going to desperate measures to get these photos. So are you going to use, dating apps to hook up with somebody to take a picture? Are you going to join a dating app in order to take a screenshot of that dating app? And those are quite toxic, dangerous places. And it's the lengths you're going to have to go to adhere to these new standards that keep changing and updating. And yeah, it isn't a fair system because yes, someone could have loads of images and photos, whereas someone might not even have a phone. So how do you compete with these two, different standards of evidence?
Well, yeah, that's maybe the bridge that we don't have an answer on the topic of this panel session on means of proof. I think that will stay in asylum claims always a point of attention. I would like to have a big round of applause for 4 beautiful papers. Because that's what I learned from this, that it really shows that in-depth research through interviews is really revealing a lot about practice in the credibility assessment. So thank you very much. I think there's now a coffee break and then we meet here again. Yeah, I'm looking at you.